Good morning and welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is listening, how we actually get messages. We actually get information from our deep wisdom, our heart, our belly, our soul. And when we listen, life can be so much easier, but we've been trained out of this for so long. So let's take a look today at listening and maybe ways that we can cultivate paying attention and allow ourselves to access flow more readily as we do so. So before we get started, let's take a minute or two to get present. Let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale, exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your cells, your molecules, your electrons, creating a brilliant beam of light and energy from your heart out into the world. And as you exhale, exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's press our palms together. Vigorously rub your hands together, feel the friction, the temperature, the pressure, the motion, the tickling and tingling when you stop, and allow all those sensations to bring you present right here, right now, into this remarkable physical form that enables you to experience life. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So good to be with you today. Welcome to everybody who's joining us. So today we're talking about listening. And this conversation comes from a conversation with a client who we were talking about reconnecting because this person has lots and lots on their plate and finds themselves engaging in all kinds of things, that some of which support them in their vision for themselves. Some of those things feel like a distraction, and some of those things just don't feel fulfilling, but they're engaged with all these things, sort of a fear of missing out on what could be good opportunities. Oftentimes we get a sense about whether moving forward in a particular direction will be supportive to us or not. We get a visceral feeling, but we've been taught to override these feelings. We've been taught not to pay attention. We've been taught to push through and push past. And oftentimes we lead with our mind, which can justify and make a case for all kinds of things that actually are not in real alignment with ourselves and our being and our greater intention in life. And so we'll often do things because we think we should, or we've been told that it'll be good for us, and yet we get this feeling. And when we ignore that, what we're doing is we're denying our own wisdom. When we do that, we're allowing ourselves to not to cultivate a situation that is a situation of mistrust, where we don't listen, and then we end up with circumstances that challenging and sometimes actually quite destructive. And then that erodes our trust for ourselves. And so when we don't trust, I tend to, good morning, Rosalind. So good to have you here with us this morning. We're talking about listening and trusting what we know, like being willing to know what we know. And it's not always sound, obviously. It's not always a little voice in our heads that is talking to us. Oftentimes we get a visceral feeling. And so I had a call from a client this morning who recognized one of these visceral feelings after we'd been having a conversation about trusting oneself and reconnecting to oneself and cultivating one's intuition. So intuition is like a muscle that we get to cultivate. It's when we have a knowing. It's only when we honor that knowing, when we pay attention, that knowing then grows, that communication then grows, because it recognizes that we'll pay attention. But we've been taught in so many ways to silence that communication. And so many of us are fearful in the world and feel like we can't trust ourselves, can't trust others, and the world becomes a very frightening place. And when we cultivate a sense of self-trust and listening and faith that that we have a guidance system. Good morning, Kimberly. So good to have you here with us this morning. We're talking about listening to your inner voice of wisdom. So this is an opportunity to reconnect with that deep wisdom that we have. So this person that gave me a call this morning after we had this conversation about paying attention to how they're responding to these different people and these different circumstances in the context of work particularly. And they said they had an experience yesterday where after our conversation, where they were talking to one of these people in their lives that they get very, very triggered by. And they said they were entertaining the possibility of being in business with this person. And in the context of that consideration, they just felt their heart constrict. Like they said, it was an absolutely visceral feeling. And they wanted to have a conversation about it because it had just come off this session where we were talking about exactly that and how critical it is to honor that. And it doesn't mean that you don't dig more deeply into what's going on and what might have created that response, but we do get to honor that knowing. You know, like if you're in a place and you get a bad feeling, get out of there. You know, if you're walking down the street and there's somebody walking on the other side and you get a bad feeling, get out of there. These are, if you're meeting somebody and you just doesn't feel right, don't try to make that person, don't necessarily bring that person closer. Be willing to honor what you know. Rosalind says, in having a conversation with another, sometimes I find myself thinking that the other person is talking too much. I have that experience sometimes too, Rosalind. I find that I start to disengage. Perhaps it's my thought of what I was going to respond with goes away. I often, when somebody is going on and on and on, I often disengage as well. And if I don't get disengaged, sometimes I get really frustrated. Sometimes people talk just to hear themselves. And when that's the case, when there's not a contribution, when they're lost in their own mind, and my experience is that it doesn't matter that I'm even there anymore, I get resentful of it. And I sometimes feel like I'm being held hostage. It's interesting. I get really annoyed around that. That's one of my trigger things. If somebody is talking and has something valuable to say, that's one thing. But if they're saying the same thing over and over and over and over, yeah. So Rosalind's laughing at feeling held hostage by these people. Yeah, because it's a matter of, well, am I going to be polite and let them go on and on? Is that really polite? So this is something that occurs for me in the context of moderating movie nights sometimes. Every now and then there'll be someone who starts talking and continues talking and is going around and around in circles and not speaking anything that's really contributing to the group, kind of getting lost in their own world. And I'm called to interrupt them because they've sort of hijacked the conversation, and in my perspective are being disrespectful of the entire group. And unfortunately, what happens sometimes is that those people then become angry and indignant that they've been interrupted. And it's a really difficult balance to find, to be respectful of the energy of the group, to try and be responsive to the energy of the group, as well as to be respectful of the person speaking. And I used the word polite earlier. We have this notion of social propriety that has us be polite, like to endure other people's self-indulgence in that kind of conversation and their disconnection, and their unwillingness to recognize the impact that they're having, which I consider impolite too. This whole impolite thing is an interesting conversation. And also the things that get us all triggered. It's very interesting. But I understand what you're saying about people who just go on and on and on, talking too much. That's a pet peeve. What can I say? You just, you got me. Anyway, we are talking about listening. And so I'm guessing, Rosalind, that conversation or that comment came from the notion of listening to other people. And we often are more generous in listening to other people than we are in listening to ourselves. When we have, oftentimes we have looping conversations. That's not the kind of listening I'm talking about. Although we can notice that we have this looping conversation and then maybe dive in more deeply to find out what's underlying that can be a really awesome and productive form of listening. But validating the looping conversation, other than to say, wow, isn't that interesting? Is that a conversation I really want to continue? Because we get held hostage by those conversations too. Those conversations from self to self. And that can be pretty disconcerting and interesting. We don't even know we're having that robotic, automatic sort of behavioral conversation a lot of the time. And if we can recognize it and step back and say, oh, isn't that interesting? We then don't have to be held hostage by it. We don't have to feel that we are being overwhelmed by it. We don't have to be, we gain some freedom from that program that is just going and going and going, the obsession of it. We can, once we see it, we can become more of the observer of it. It doesn't always stop the conversation, but we can then give ourselves permission to not have to pay attention to it, not have to get all engaged in it. So that's kind of an awesome thing. Rosalind says, I like that response. I'll use that. Oh, isn't that interesting? Well, curiosity is just the most wonderful curative for so many things. So Rosalind continues, I do look for the gift that is being presented. Then when it comes time for a response, I find myself trying to recollect the essence of what they wanted me to hear, which requires effort, more effort than a back and forth conversation, perhaps a skill of listening for me to look closer at. Yeah. And oftentimes when people are saying something and I am intrigued by it, or maybe there's something they're saying that I'm not really sure of, I will interrupt and say, I'm sorry, can you, sometimes I'll say, I'm sorry. Sometimes I'll say, wait, what is this? What is this that you're talking about? And because I don't want to get lost, I don't want to lose what they're speaking to. Welcome, David. How wonderful to have you joining us. I think this might be your first time. Wonderful. Anyway, David says, yes, it's great to not feel controlled by our minds, to be pulled in by our minds and other people's minds. Yes, we can cultivate the observer, this other dimension of self that kind of gets to see this bigger picture. And when I'm talking about paying attention to this voice or these, hi, David, I'm actually Mira. This is Mira Rubin. I don't know if I changed my name today or not. Yes, it says Mira Rubin. So we are on Ruth's channel. So it's wonderful to have you joining us. Anyway, I go live each weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern on Enlightened World Network, and we also broadcast this on Ruth's Facebook page sometimes too. So anyway, when we talk about listening, what we're talking about is listening sometimes be beyond. So Kimberly says, will this be permanent? I'm not sure what you're asking, Kimberly. Will what be permanent? Help me out. Anyway, when we're talking about listening, sometimes we get to listen through. So sometimes people will be really angry. Sometimes we'll be really angry. We have this really loud conversation about being really angry about something. And then we can, if we can cultivate this observer, step back and say, oh, wow, isn't that interesting? Look how angry I am. What's going on? Or we can look at the person, listen to the other person and say, wow, they're really angry. What what's underlying that? What is going on? Because I had a conversation with somebody the other day, and they were being really aggressive and really hostile. And in the conversation, somehow, I'm not really clear how we got there, but they said something about wasting their time. And rather than reacting to, well, it's not a waste of time, blah, 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 or whatever, rather than getting defensive, what I heard is that they were really pressed for time. And I said, wait a second, are you saying that you don't have time to be engaged with this? And they said, yes. And I said, oh, well, that's 100% fine. Don't feel in any way obligated to be engaged in this. And it shifted the whole experience. It shifted their aggression. It shifted their anger, because they were not listening to themselves, where their knowing was saying, this is too much. This is more than I can handle. And they weren't able to say no outright. And so I was able, thankfully, to listen through the anger and the aggression to hear the real concern, which was that they had overextended themselves. And so I was able to relieve them of that obligation. And so this is a really, really valuable skill, listening. And it's often listening beyond, or listening into, listening through the outward expression to the foundational message. And for instance, sometimes we'll have a visceral experience, and we don't necessarily know how to interpret it. And for instance, the person that I was speaking with said that the one that had the visceral experience that spoke with me this morning said that in the past, they've always identified this experience as fear, for example. And then if they recognized it as fear, they felt an obligation to push past the fear. And I think that there can be a benefit sometimes to pushing past fear. But I think if that's the question, that we get to look more deeply, that we get to listen more closely, that we get to really explore more of what is that visceral sense? What is the message that's being communicated? Getting curious about it. Again, curiosity being a cure for so much confusion. When we get curious, we give ourselves the opportunity to discover things that we might not otherwise have been able to recognize. So Rosalind says, Mira, I appreciate your ability to understand my cryptic input. Sometimes typing and thought doesn't get conveyed so clearly. So thank you for your listening skills. Thank you, Rosalind. Thank you for that acknowledgement. I appreciate that. Yeah, so what we're doing is listening for the intention or the underlying motivation. And that's what I mean by listening through. Oftentimes I have, in doing coaching, I often have clients who are experiencing tremendous frustration, and sometimes that shows itself as hostility. Sometimes it shows itself as belligerence even. And it's easier in that context because I'm clear about my role and my permission but it gives an opportunity to be able to listen past the words, listen past the demeanor into like what's really going on here. And it is by cultivating that state of curiosity that we gain greater access to that kind of information. So by being curious about, well, what's going on over there, or what's going on in here, and what's underneath that, it can be very rich and enlightening experience. So I think that's it for this morning, our conversation about listening. It has many gifts to return to us. And again, I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection. And I go live here each weekday morning on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page and YouTube channel, and at 9 a.m. Eastern. And good morning, Dido. So good to have you joining us too. Anyway, until next time. And Kimberly, I appreciate you too so much. And David, it was great having you join us, and everybody else who's been with us. And until next time, so much love to you.